So just this past week, I got the chance to sit down and play a preview build of the upcoming game, A Plague Tale: Requiem. And I have to say, I came away really impressed. I enjoyed just about everything about it, with one notable exception being the performance of the build. Many sections of the game just didn't run terribly well, but pretty much everything else about it I really liked. The visuals, storytelling, presentation, level design, and just the overall experience was a positive one. So far, from everything that I've seen, I think A Plague Tale: Requiem is shaping up to be a fantastic game as long as they can fix performance. So here in today's video, I want to share my experience with you, go into a bit more detail about the game, its system, structure, what it is you'll be doing, and just share my general thoughts and impressions expanded upon beyond what I just said. Okay, so let's jump in. For starters, this is the sequel to A Plague Tale: Innocence. That game launched back in 2019 to rave reviews. It averaged around a 9 out of 10 from most outlets, and Steam users have rated it as very positive. Overall, the game was just considered quite a good third-person narrative adventure. Well, the sequel appears to have taken all of that and expanded upon it. So in terms of story, Requiem takes place 6 months after the events of the first game. Amicia and Hugo, our two main characters, have left their homeland behind, headed south to find a new life. But of course, things don't go as planned. Hugo's powers reawaken, and then they find themselves surrounded by enemy soldiers and an overwhelming swarm of rats. Now, as a narrative-driven adventure game, you'll be moving through the world with gameplay bits woven in between the story. You'll arrive at a location, for example, and maybe explore the environment or speak to some NPCs. Maybe you'll watch a cutscene, and then, oh no, something will happen, and you'll need to either hide, run away, or fight before moving on to the next area. Now, from the sections that I played, which were chapters 6 and 7, I would say that the gameplay to story split was about 75-25. It is mostly gameplay where you are controlling the character, but with plenty of story. And even the gameplay bits, a lot of time are spent on the narrative. Like as you walk around, Amicia and Hugo will talk back and forth, discussing what's going on, what they're thinking and feeling, and even pointing out things in the environment. Like, oh look, there are some frogs jumping in that creek, or hey, we found some feathers, or what is that shipwreck, stuff like that. If you didn't play the first game, you should be well aware. It is a narrative-driven experience. This is about kind of playing the story and not so much focused on gameplay bookended with story. It is a engrossing story experience, but man, I gotta tell you, that story has been fantastic from what I've seen. By and large, I don't really even play games for story. I am more of a gameplay-focused gamer. I like the interactive experience of gaming and like improving at various mechanics, getting better. But when the story is done really well in a game, I enjoy it, and I have loved what I've seen so far. The voice acting, the tone and setting, like what is actually playing out, it's all been super engaging and has kept me wanting to push forward, play more, and see what happens next. Big shout out to the writers and voice actors, especially who play Amicia and Hugo. I'm just super impressed with the performance. Like everything is really well done. And again, I typically don't care about story, but this is pretty good. And all of that is accentuated by just how gorgeous the game is. The visual fidelity and art direction I found very aesthetically pleasing. They do a good job of building this like oppressive, plague-infested world. Remember, the setting is there's just this crazy horde swarm of rats that just consume everything. Not exactly the most pleasant thing, but it is also then touched with glimmers of natural beauty in the environments. There were a few points in my playthrough where I would just put the controller down for a second to take in the environment. Like when I came across this big sweeping field full of flowers with rolling hills in the distance popping against a bright blue sky, or there was this area with this like really foggy, craggy coastline and the sound of the ocean, waves coming in and out, and seagulls. It's just all really good. They built some impressive atmosphere with all the combination of visual, sounds, lighting, and the weather effects. I found it very immersive, to put it quite simply. But storytelling and world building isn't everything, and like I said, I am mostly a gameplay focused gamer. And to that end, I feel that Requiem is simple but competent when it comes to the gameplay that it's delivering. In terms of what you'll actually be doing when playing, it's a mixture of navigating the environment, solving puzzles, and then some light combat. From a majority of what I've played, this is very much a stealth game. Much of your time will be spent hiding behind objects or concealing yourself in tall grass as you kind of survey the environment and try to plan your next course of action. And let me actually lay it out here to give you kind of a clearer picture. I don't want to be too specific in actual details to spoil the story, because the story is the big thing, like I mentioned, but I do want to give you a basic idea as to how the game plays. So as I mentioned earlier in this preview build, we started in chapter 6. At that point, our duo were in search of an island but unsure how to get there. Just stumbling through the world, they came across this camp, and asking around ended up finding someone who might know the way. But then a troop of soldiers show up looking for our pair specifically. They were searching, hunting for us, and a helpful NPC attempted to sneak us out of the camp, but we were spotted last minute and ended up tumbling into a ravine, and the cutscene ended, and then it was time to actually play. So for the most part, you are directly controlling Amicia. You will move her around with the joystick or mouse and keyboard. I found gamepad more comfortable with this game. That's worth mentioning. And then at the same time, her brother Hugo is right by her side constantly. You basically move as a pair. So the ravine that we fell into opened up into what looked to be a quarry that the two of us, the game told me, had to make our way through. And that is basically how the game is structured. You will have like one clear direction to move in, but there will be many times multiple ways to navigate that path. So before I entered the quarry, I was able to look around the small area that we were in, and I found some resources in chest and on the ground. There was also a crafting table, which I'll touch on in a bit. And then I moved my way into the narrow entry into the hollowed ground, and this is where the stealth gameplay kicked in. The mines that we were going into were full of patrolling soldiers who were hunting us down, and that's basically where I had to just try to dodge their line of sight using things like pillars, piles of debris, and crates. That, coupled with distraction techniques, like we get this unlimited supply of rocks that we can just toss to draw the attention of guards and sneak by them. And mostly that's what you're doing. You're having to sneak because you are very weak and you die very easily. I need to emphasize this. This is not a game where you're like running up and getting into fights. That is not going to happen. You are, for the most part, very fragile and must avoid direct head-to-head combat because you are at a severe disadvantage. As in, like, you cannot run up and start wailing on a soldier. If you do, they will knock you down and one-shot you. However, you do have a lot of different tools at your disposal to deal with these. So gameplay in Requiem is much like the original, but just expanded upon, whether that is your ability to stay hidden, to distract, to run and hide, or the combat. Many of the areas you move through will be moderately sized with multiple paths, like I said, and then some sections will be easier for different things, for combat or for staying hidden. And there are usually multiple ways to do either one of those as well. So for stealth, there'll be areas where you can climb up, crawl under objects, or hide in tall grass. You're able to distract them, as I mentioned, by throwing rocks, and there are even some objects in the environment that can help enhance this. Like there'll be these piles of armor that create a much louder noise if you hit them, distracting a wider range of enemies. And then similarly, your lethal options are more varied as well. You can take enemies out by melee, but it is quite risky and does require the use of this limited consumable. You get these one-time use knives, essentially. There is also counter system, so if you get spotted and a guard gets close to you, they will knock you down, and then you have an opportunity to counter and stun them, which lets you get away. Or again, if you have one of those knives, you could follow them up quickly. But if there's more than one enemy, you're just done. Like, that's it. You can counter one, but if someone's right next to you, after you counter, they're gonna swing at you, and then at that point you're dead. You basically get, it's a two strike, you're out kind of thing. You get knocked down, and then if you don't get away or deal with the enemies around you, you're dead is what happens, and you restart from a checkpoint. I will add though that if you manage to stun an enemy either with rocks or smokes, you can eliminate them. There's like a takedown animation, but it takes a very long time and leaves you super vulnerable. So again, if there's more than one enemy on your tail, it is GG. In general, you are just very weak at melee, driving that home. So for the most part, to dispatch enemies, what you'll be doing is doing things from range or using the environment. So ranged abilities come in a few different flavors. There's a mixture of range type and then the consumable. So there are 4 range types. There are your hands, a slingshot, jars, and crossbows. And then there's ammo or the consumables that go with that. And these include rocks, ignifer, which is fire, extinguish, which is a smoke or stun, tar, which creates a sticky tar but also adds to fire, and then odorous, which is used to attract the swarms of rats. So each of these will have their own like use cases and then are further altered by the weapon that they're also used with. So when you toss something with your hands, it's going to be a quick throw. It is a quiet throw, but it is done at a very short range. Put something in a slingshot, it will be slower and louder, but it's going to hit much harder and it has a longer range. damage. And then there are these jars, which basically turn things into explosives. They need a special ammo that is consumed whenever you toss one, but anything tossed in a jar just has a much larger radius as well as a longer duration than anything that you toss by hand or sling. And then finally, there's the crossbow, super long range, although you have to bolt first, and sort of like the knives and the jars, the bolts are a single-use item that you just don't have a lot of. I think the most I had of at any given time were 3 bolts for my crossbow, and that was it. Now, a regular bolt attack will one-shot most basic enemies, and then bolts enhanced with consumables will kind of do what you expect, create a plume of smoke or a fire, but then also you can shoot these bolts that are enhanced into certain objects in the world. There'll be things that'll be kind of smattered with this white, I don't know what it is, tar or something, and it will last a very long time. So there are multiple sections in the game where you will shoot a fire bolt or an odorous bolt at this object, and it will just stay there for seemingly forever. I don't know how long it actually lasts, but it lasted longer than I could see it extinguish, basically. So, and the bottom line is, as you can probably tell, there are a lot of ranged options. And like I said, that is what you will be doing the most of. You'll use a slingshot with a rock to try to knock out enemies that don't have helmets, or you could sling fire onto them, setting them ablaze. Or maybe you will douse the lamp that they're carrying in their hands, which is what they use to keep the rats away. And then once the lamp is out, the rats then swarm in and consume them. In addition to this, there's some other cool things in the game when it comes to combat and dealing with enemies. For example, your brother Hugo has special powers. He has the ability to see enemies through walls, which makes it much easier to navigate the environment. It's like a detective vision, Batman vision. But best of all is he's got this ability to control swarms of rats, which you can use to consume enemies that aren't by a light source. Very, very powerful ability. Later on in the second chapter that we played, this was limited by a meter. The meter would build up as long as we would use the rats, which seemed kind of necessary because otherwise you're just controlling the swarm of rats and consuming everything not by fire. And even if someone does have fire, you can extinguish the fire and then use the rats to swarm them. So, but in the sections of the game that you do have use of this, it is a pretty cool tool. And then also in that second chapter, we ended up coming across a third companion that would also help us in combat. We were able to basically command him to attack enemies, and he would eliminate anyone 1 versus 1. He would just run up shouting and then take them out. Now, if too many enemies got around him, he would go into a down state and you would fail the mission if he died. So you'd have to use him strategically. You couldn't just send him into a large troop of enemies. It does sound OP, but honestly, they balance this out by the fact that when you have access to this ability, there's just tons of enemies everywhere, and it kind of would be too difficult without him, basically. And that's, I guess, something else worth mentioning is that as I played through, it was cool because they were opening up new mechanics and new ways to deal with the different encounters that were like context sensitive to the situation, to where we were, to how many enemies there were, to the story, all of that. It's really, really cool stuff. Playing through the game unlocks new tools to deal with new challenges. I really enjoyed it. And that's just about everything in terms of the game's combat. I guess the last thing worth mentioning is that we did notice the occasional QuickTime event in a couple of cutscenes. These seem few and far between though. Didn't see a lot of those. Overall, I'll say that I really enjoy the varied toolbox that combat offers in this game. In general, it does play on the slower side. This is not like fast-paced Twitch action combat. It's not that kind of a game. It is more of like a tense, slowed down stealth game with really, really punishing situations where if you slip up, if you're caught off guard, you're gonna die and you're gonna have to restart at the last checkpoint. I should mention that the checkpoints seemed very generous as well. I never felt like I was set too far back. And beyond the stealth and the combat, another major element of this game is the puzzle solving. Most large stretches of gameplay will be full of various obstacles and challenges that you have to work your way through. Outside of navigating any patrolling guards, a lot of times this boils down to finding your way past the hordes of rats. As I touched on already, there are many ways to distract or move them away. You could use fire to burn them or make them run from that light source. You could toss tar into an existing fire. This will create a large explosion, pushing the rats back and then giving you a window of opportunity to dash through. Sometimes you might find a torch which can burn for a limited time, and then you could just walk through certain sections with this. The game also mixes up these puzzles with combat and timers, so you'll have to do a certain sequence and react in time, execute in a proper manner. Otherwise, again, you will fail and die because the rats will swarm in or the enemies will catch up to you or anything like that. And from what I saw, there typically seems to be a few different ways that you could bypass these various puzzles, the rat hordes, the patrolling enemies, everything. It never boiled down to a single solution that you had to figure out, and I appreciated that. In fact, I did a second playthrough of both chapters, and that second time around, I tried new options for every challenge, for every puzzle, and was able to navigate them most of the time in a different way than I had prior. For a game that is as fairly linear as this is, I felt like there were more options than I guess I would expect. A couple other parts of the game that I want to touch on. So as I mentioned, there are crafting benches in this game. You're able to use these to upgrade Amicia's weapons. Like you can make your slingshot silent, or you can make it so that you reload your crossbow faster. Upgrades will cost resources that you find while playing as you walk around the environment. You just find like chests and things on the grounds, or enemy soldiers will drop stuff, and you loot all of this. And it kind of helps incentivize thoroughly searching areas rather than just beelining it for the exit. Amicia herself also has some sort of progression, like you can move faster while stealth, unlock the ability to push enemies into the fire. I couldn't actually tell how this unlock happened. It wasn't like a skill point or a level up thing, and it seemed like the bars associated with this progression just kind of slowly filled. I'm not sure if it's because of doing things progresses certain bars, or if it's just progressing through the story progresses certain bars, but either way, there is a progression for Amicia as well as her weapons. The game also has collectibles like souvenirs. You'll find different things in the environment that will kind of unlock this encyclopedia that you have. There's also Hugo's collection, which are these bird feathers that you'll find in different spots in the game. Just a nice little extra thing to search for, expand on the narrative. And the last thing I want to touch on is the game's performance. Now, as I mentioned, this game looks great. There's some really cool just visuals and environment and all that stuff, but boy, did it run poorly. I tried playing around with the settings a bit, dropping it all to medium or putting it on the balance setting. It was still chugging in certain spots. This wasn't a constant issue while playing, but it happened frequently enough that it did detract from the overall experience. And even occasionally, I would get frame drops and stuttering in the middle of combat, which is a deal breaker for me. Like, you can't have the game failing to run smoothly when you're trying to take out enemies, especially with how precarious that can be and how one slip up can just mean you're doom in a game like this. In fact, I should note as well, this all you've been seeing is from B-roll and trailers. They did not allow us to do and show direct capture. They said you can check out this preview, you can share your impressions, but you can only use this B-roll footage. I think that alone, that they aren't letting us capture and show that gameplay, is likely due to them being aware of the current performance issues and not wanting that to be the highlight. And all around, I do think this game is looking great. I love the world, the characters, the storytelling. I enjoy the almost like hardcore stealth experience that it delivers and the difficulty that that entails, but they must fix the performance issues before release. And I would tell you that is the one major thing you're going to want to keep an eye on once the review scores come out as we get closer to launch. See how the performance is, because as of now, it really wasn't great, but I love everything else about the game. That is just a notable detraction from the overall experience. I hope they fix it though, and if they do, just like its predecessor, this could end up being another hit if you like narrative-driven adventures and experiences. And that's going to do it for me today, guys. Thank you so much for joining me as we check out the upcoming game, A Plague Tale Requiem. It was a lot of fun, and I'm liking it overall. I am. Thanks for watching. Hope you guys enjoy it. I'll see you next time. Take it easy.